You've heard about Auschwitz, but you probably haven't heard this name. Unit 731. It was worse, and we made sure you wouldn't find out. Until now. Cold open, a secret buried in ice. You've never been there, but the ground remembers. Just outside Harbin, in northeastern China, there's a place where winter never truly ends. It's quiet. So quiet you might think nothing ever happened there. Just frost, drifting snow, and a silence so deep, it feels like time itself has been frozen. But if you stop and listen, really listen, you'll hear the kind of silence that only comes after a scream. Because beneath that frozen soil once stood something far worse than a battlefield. Not a war zone, a system. A place where death wasn't just expected, it was measured, cataloged, recorded, over and over again. They called it Unit 731. Officially, it was known as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Imperial Japanese Army. Sounds harmless, doesn't it? Like something you'd see printed on the side of a hospital truck. But this wasn't a hospital, and what happened here was never meant to be healed. Between 1936 and 1945, over 3,000 human beings were brought to this place. Men, women, children. None of them ever walked out. They weren't buried, they weren't mourned, they weren't even given names. To those who ran the facility, they were simply logs, maruta in Japanese. Something to burn, to split open, to dissect, to extract data from. Because that's what Unit 731 was about. Learning. Not learning how to save lives, but how to end them. What did they learn? They learned how long it takes the human body to freeze to death. What happens to your lungs when they're filled with poisonous gas. How a child's organs decay if infected with plague. These weren't war crimes in their minds. These were test results, data points, numbers on a chart. And when the war ended, when Japan surrendered, the camps emptied, and the snow began to melt, you might think the world would demand justice, that someone, anyone, would be held accountable. But that's not what happened. Because when the American forces arrived, they didn't destroy what they found. They didn't arrest the doctors. They didn't even seal the records. They opened them, studied them, copied them, and then they made a deal. They weren't punished because the United States wanted what they learned. What was Unit 731? It didn't look like a killing ground, not from the outside. The facility resembled any other military compound, clean, symmetrical, with wide gravel paths and buildings of brick and concrete. Guard towers rose above the perimeter, smokestacks in the distance. And above the main gate, a sign so ordinary, so bureaucratic, it felt almost absurd. Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. Harmless, even helpful, like something built to protect civilians. But this wasn't a clinic, and what happened behind those walls was never meant to be cured. Unit 731 was created in 1936 by the Imperial Japanese Army, under the direction of a man named Shiro Ishii, a physician, a microbiologist, and a man obsessed with the future of warfare. Not bullets, not bombs, but germs. Plague, anthrax, cholera, smallpox. In his vision, disease itself would become a weapon, and Japan would master it before anyone else. But to build those weapons, he needed test subjects. Not rats, not simulations. He wanted living, breathing, dying humans. And he found them, here, in the frozen frontier of Manchuria. a region Japan had seized during its brutal expansion into China. Remote, lawless, already soaked in violence. Perfect for what Ishii had in mind. Unit 731 wasn't some back alley torture house. It was enormous. Over 6 square kilometers in size. It had its own power plant, water system, airport, and rail line. It was a city within a city. It had laboratories, a prison wing, surgical theaters, morgues, incinerators, and even underground tunnels. It ran like a machine, a precise, well-funded machine. Thousands of staff worked here. Scientists, nurses, technicians, guards. Some believed they were serving their country. Others knew exactly what they were doing. But none of them left, and none of them spoke out. Officially, Unit 731 was dedicated to public health research. But in reality, it was an industrial factory for weaponizing death. Its mission was simple: collect data, push the limits of the human body, break it apart, systematically, clinically, and write down the results. The raw material for that data? Human lives. They didn't call them patients. They called them subjects, logs, maruta, and the things they endured weren't medicine, weren't science. They were something else entirely. Something colder, something darker, something designed not to heal the human body, but to erase it. The experiments, science without mercy. There were no charts, no anesthesia, no consent, and absolutely no chance of survival. Inside Unit 731, they didn't conduct experiments the way a scientist might in a controlled laboratory. They performed them like acts in a cold, precise theater. There was no applause, no ethics, no audience. Just blood, silence, and someone taking notes. The subjects, called maruta, meaning logs, were not treated as people, not even close. They were tools, instruments, organic matter waiting to be opened up. Their captors didn't wonder if they were scared or in pain. They wondered how long their hearts would keep beating after being cut open. And they wrote it down. Vivisection was routine. Prisoners were dissected alive, without anesthetic. Organs were removed one by one, slowly, so the doctors could observe what shut down first. Lungs were taken while still drawing breath. Hearts were exposed and watched as they beat for the last time, sometimes for minutes, sometimes seconds. It was all data. Other experiments were colder, more calculated. Limbs were submerged in ice water until the skin turned black with frostbite. Then, the flesh was struck with wooden sticks to test for brittleness. Prisoners were sealed inside pressure chambers, their bodies crushed slowly as researchers recorded how the lungs collapsed, how the eyes ruptured, how long it took for consciousness to fade. Disease was introduced on purpose. Victims were tied down, and plague-infected fleas were released onto their bare skin. The fevers came fast, then vomiting, skin necrosis, bleeding from the eyes and gums. The scientists didn't flinch. They stood by holding clipboards, noting the time of death. Pregnant women were infected with syphilis. They weren't treated. They were dissected, along with their unborn children, to track how the infection passed from mother to fetus. Some were injected with gonorrhea directly into their reproductive systems. Others were forced to have sex with infected prisoners, all for clinical consistency. There were more. Some were tied to wooden stakes and used as live targets for grenades coated in anthrax. Others were made to drink seawater until their kidneys shut down, or had air injected into their veins to simulate embolisms. Some were simply left to starve, their food replaced with sawdust, while doctors measured weight loss against the rate of hallucination. There were children, always children. They were easier to restrain. Their tissue was considered cleaner. Some were exposed to lethal temperatures. Some were infected just to see how fast they would die. And when they did, They were cut open within minutes. One internal report, later declassified by U.S. intelligence, reads simply, Maruta, number 267. Expired at 7:38 a.m. Autopsy began at 7:41. 3 minutes. That's how long it took to move from death to dissection. No mourning, no moment of silence, just procedure. This wasn't chaos. It wasn't wartime madness. It was order, routine, a system, efficient, documented, filed. When the bodies piled up, they were burned in on-site incinerators. The smell hung in the air for miles. But inside, the researchers went on. They had results to log, numbers to check, a report to finish. To them, the screams weren't cries for help. They were background noise. And to this day, no one knows the exact number of people who died at Unit 731. Some say 3,000. Others believe it was 10,000 or more, when you count the nearby villages that were exposed to weaponized plague just to study infection spread. Unit 731 was never just a place. It was a mechanism, a machine built for one purpose, to answer a single unspoken question. How far can you push the human body before it breaks? Who were the victims? They weren't soldiers. They weren't spies. They weren't hardened criminals or enemies of the state. The people who were brought into Unit 731 were farmers, mothers, factory workers, school children, prisoners of war, civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. They came from all over the region: Manchuria, Korea, Mongolia, parts of the Soviet Union. Most of them were Chinese. None of them had names on paper. Only numbers. Only expiration times. Some were kidnapped in raids, ripped from their homes in the dead of night. Others were deceived, told they were being relocated for work, for treatment, for safety. Some simply vanished during a walk to the market, a trip to the doctor, a routine journey from one village to another. They never came back. And no one ever told their families where they had gone. There were women, many of them pregnant, used in reproductive experiments. Some were forced to deliver their babies under observation, only to watch as both were dissected moments later. Others were infected with venereal diseases and denied care, their bodies used to observe the transmission of illness across generations. There were children, not by accident, by design. Children were easy to handle. Their bodies responded more quickly to disease, and their tissue, the researchers claimed, was cleaner. Infants were infected with tuberculosis, dysentery, anthrax. They were not treated. They were not comforted. They were studied, and then they were removed. There were elderly men taken to test how long the body could last under starvation. Some were fed only sawdust. Others were left without water. Their deaths were slow, their suffering precisely recorded. And still others, young men and women, barely out of adolescence, were brought in simply to test the weapons, tied to wooden posts, exposed to grenades, flamethrowers, mustard gas, not as soldiers, not even as prisoners, but as practice targets. They weren't told why. They weren't given a choice. They weren't allowed a final word. Once they entered the gates of Unit 731, they were erased, first from public record, then from history. There were no photographs, no funerals, no graves, just open fields where the snow now falls undisturbed. The doctors avoided eye contact with them. They were ordered not to speak, not to learn names, not to treat them like people. Because it's easier to hurt someone when you've convinced yourself they're not human. In official records, the victims are labeled only as Maruta, logs, like trees, like things you cut down, haul away, and burn. One woman in Harbin, decades later, said quietly, "I used to think my brother had run away. Now I wonder if he ever left at all." Historians estimate that over 3,000 people were killed inside Unit 731. Others say it could be tens of thousands, once you count the villages exposed to germ warfare and never warned. But the truth is, we'll never know. Because the documents were destroyed, the witnesses were silenced, and the only ones left to speak for the dead are us. Not because the world forgot them, but because someone wanted them forgotten. End of War and the Silence Bought with Data, August 1945. The war was over. The bombs had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan had surrendered. And for the first time in years, the guns fell quiet. Across Asia, the scars of conflict began to show. Cities in rubble, nations divided, millions displaced. But in Manchuria, the silence held something deeper, something colder. Because just outside Harbin, the gates of Unit 731 finally swung open. What the American forces found wasn't a battlefield. It was a laboratory, emptied in haste. The prison cells were abandoned, the instruments wiped down but not hidden. The bodies were gone, but the smell of them lingered. Fires still burned in the incinerators, ash clung to the corners of surgical rooms. Some of the documents had been destroyed, others remained, coded, chaotic, but intact. At first, the soldiers who walked through the compound were horrified. Reports sent back to headquarters described the facility as a factory of death. The scale, the precision, the utter disregard for human life, it defied belief. It rivaled anything seen in Nazi Germany. But then someone asked a different kind of question, a colder one. What did they learn? Because buried in the drawers and locked cabinets were hundreds of pages of research. Charts tracking how long it took to freeze a limb solid. Graphs on internal organ failure by infection type. Full autopsies of victims exposed to plague, anthrax, smallpox. This wasn't chaos, it was data. And data, in a world just entering the Cold War, was valuable. So the question became simpler. Do we destroy it, or do we take it? That decision was made quietly. No press conferences, no trials. In late 1947, American intelligence officers made contact with Shiro Ishii and his team. In exchange for handing over all research materials, lab records, and biological weapons data, the United States promised full immunity. No prosecutions, no tribunal, no charges of war crimes. The men behind Unit 731 were not arrested. They were protected. Calculating. The data, one U.S. official wrote, is too valuable to risk losing, however unethically obtained. And so, the deal was struck. Truth in exchange for silence. Scientific discovery, bought with the blood of thousands. The files were shipped back to the United States, stored in military archives, studied at Fort Detrick, Maryland, the center of American biological warfare research. Some of the Unit 731 doctors even advised U.S. scientists, anonymously. Their names erased, their crimes never mentioned, their work repurposed. Shiro Ishii himself lived out the rest of his life in peace. He was never tried, never arrested, never forced to testify. He gave lectures on public health, consulted for the government, died in 1959, bitterly quietly, comfortably, without consequence. Many of his colleagues went on to serve in Japan's post-war medical system. Some received pensions, others taught at universities, a few entered politics. None were punished, not a single one. And the victims? Their names were never recorded. Their families were never notified. There were no reparations, No apologies, only blank space in history books. Erased by mutual agreement, the American public was never told. The documents were classified, the survivors were ignored. And the world, exhausted from war, looked the other way. Because justice was inconvenient, and knowledge was power. We didn't burn the evidence, we filed it. And we kept the fire for ourselves. The American deal, truth for immunity. The United States didn't just uncover what happened at Unit 731. They absorbed it. They read the files, reviewed the notes, and they didn't turn away in disgust. They leaned in. Because inside those pages, smudged with ash and blood, were things no one else had. Observations not from simulations, but from real human bodies, real infections, real death. The kind of data that couldn't be ethically gathered, but now sat, complete and precise, ready to be used. Plague, cholera, smallpox. How disease spreads through the bloodstream. How fast the lungs collapse when the air pressure drops. How the brain responds to hypothermia, starvation, nerve gas. It was horrifying, and it was priceless. The Soviets would want it, the British too, but America had the chance to get there first. So, in 1947, U.S. intelligence officials reached out to Shiro Ishii. They didn't demand answers. They made an offer. If he turned over every document, every vial, every sample, if he told them everything, then he and his team would walk free. No trials, no headlines, no prison. He agreed, and so did the United States. It was a deal made in silence, not written into law, not debated in court, just a quiet understanding between victors and war criminals. You give us your knowledge, we give you your life. This wasn't the first time it had happened. After the war, the US had already recruited Nazi scientists under Operation Paperclip. Men who built rockets for Hitler were now working for NASA. Why not doctors from Unit 731? In the years that followed, America's biological warfare research expanded rapidly. At Fort Detrick, Maryland, researchers pored over the Japanese files, extracting what they needed, ignoring where it came from. Some of those findings were cited in internal memos. Others were quietly buried in classified archives. But the logic was always the same. We didn't do it, but we can use it. Shiro Ishii lived comfortably for the rest of his life. He was never questioned publicly, never admitted guilt. He died peacefully, surrounded by family. Some of his colleagues became doctors in Tokyo hospitals. Some taught biology. Others helped rebuild Japan's medical infrastructure. All of them walked free. No remorse, no record, no justice. The victims were never acknowledged. Their families never knew what happened. Their stories never made the news. Because, in the eyes of the post-war world, the information was more important than the pain. And so, Unit 731, one of the darkest atrocities of the 20th century, wasn't buried. It was absorbed, transformed from a war crime into an asset. A piece of history not remembered, but used. Some crimes are punished. Some are hidden. And some are purchased. The moral abyss. Can evil create knowledge? What do you do with knowledge born in blood? What if the only known data on frostbite came from prisoners whose arms were frozen and shattered while they were still alive? What if the most detailed autopsy notes on plague came from children deliberately infected and then dissected within minutes of death? What if the truth, accurate, precise, and undeniably useful, was obtained through the torture of thousands? Do you erase it, or do you use it? That's the question no one wanted to answer. And yet, someone already did. Because we didn't destroy the data. We filed it. We read it. We applied it. And in doing so, we crossed a line we can never uncross. The scientists at Unit 731 did not work in chaos. They worked in control. They measured. They timed. They documented. Their notes became citations. Their tables became internal references. Their numbers entered the bloodstream of modern science, quietly, without names, without context. Some justified it by saying, "The damage is already done. If we ignore what they learned, the victims died for nothing." Others said, "Using this data is an admission that the method was acceptable." Neither answer feels clean, because there is no clean answer. Can evil produce knowledge? Can truth be extracted from torture? Can medicine built on cruelty ever be trusted? And what does it mean when the most powerful nations in the world decide that some crimes aren't worth punishing because the results are too useful?
This wasn't an isolated choice.
After the war, the US brought in Nazi scientists. Some worked for NASA. Some helped develop chemical weapons. The past was not erased. It was recruited. And the precedent was set. If your research is useful enough, your sins can be forgiven or forgotten. Maybe not by the victims, but by the victors. In lecture halls around the world, young scientists study thermoregulation, infection modeling, trauma response. And sometimes, deep inside the sources, deep inside the data, a trace remains. A sentence, a statistic, a shadow. From Unit 731. Most of them will never know where it came from. And those who do may never speak of it. Because some truths, when spoken aloud, don't sound like progress. They sound like confession.
We didn't inherit justice. We chose usefulness instead. And that choice echoes.
The legacy, what was left behind. There are no monuments for them, no walls of names, no candles lit in silence, no gardens of remembrance. There is no national day of mourning, no formal apology, no gravestones bearing the truth, only frost and silence. Unit 731 was not remembered, it was buried, not by snow, but by choice. In Japan, most textbooks still omit it. In America, most citizens have never heard the name. Even today, in Harbin, the site where it all happened is little more than a hushed shadow. A small museum tucked behind fences and warnings, visited only by the few who go looking for what the world tried to forget. The doctors lived out their lives in peace. The governments moved on. The data was shelved, used, or locked away. And the victims? They remained unspoken. No names, no stories, just a number and a time of death. But memory is strange. You can burn the files, you can hide the photographs, you can deny the history, and still, somehow, the ground remembers. In quiet winters, when the snow settles thick and undisturbed on the old earth near Harbin, there's a stillness that feels deeper than weather. It's the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace. It comes from being buried alive. You may never walk there. You may never see the frozen fields. But if you've made it this far, you've done something most never will. You've remembered. And for those who had no voice, no justice, no grave, that may be the only thing left. Some stories aren't passed down. They're uncovered, like bones beneath the frost. Unit 731. The science we buried, the truth we used, the names we lost. If you made it this far, thank you. Not for watching, but for staying, for listening, for remembering, for not turning away. Most people will never hear this story, and many who do will forget it by morning. But maybe you won't, because somewhere out there, in the frost-covered silence that still lingers in Manchuria, the people who vanished, the ones without names, without graves, without justice, deserve more than silence. They deserve memory. So if this stayed with you, share it. Not for the algorithm, not for me, but because some stories don't belong to history books. They belong to the living. And if you believe, some truths should never stay buried. Subscribe, not to support a channel, but to make space for stories like this to be told again.
More stories they tried to erase.